Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it. It's good to be with you. As you can see, that smiling face over there on the screen is Mr. Craig Morley. Now, Craig comes with a number of accolades behind his name, including past chairman of the Utah Appraisal Board, current member of NAR's appraisal section, a sitting member of the Appraisal Standards Board. But Craig is here today just as Craig, and he is here today to explain what's going on in the real estate appraisal industry insofar as he can, since it changes so often. So, Craig, we're grateful that you're here. We're grateful to have somebody of your authority to answer some of our questions. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. Now, you and I have spoken about this off air. So what we're going to talk about is not a surprise to either one of us. But you and I had spoken informally in the past. Both of us are involved in education on a national level. Both of us are fairly well connected from a standpoint of what is going on politically. So let's talk about those things. Let's talk about, well, first of all, let's talk about three, I hate to say three things, but that's what I'm going to say. Three things that appraisers need to worry about, and three things that appraisers really should look forward to. So let's talk about, first of all, the three things that appraisers should worry about, not necessarily look out for, but worry about, especially over, say, the next 12 months. So, Craig, what are three things that appraisers need to lose some sleep about?
Well, you know, our list seems to be getting longer and longer of things that we probably ought to be a little bit concerned about. But certainly one of the hot topics and pressing issues of the day are the allegations of racial bias and the potential impact that could result from those claims. Now, many of these are being litigated, and there's lots of concern that depending upon how some of this litigation goes, that it could impact the appraisal landscape. But the reality is that we are not as careful as we ought to be in the way that we communicate assignment results. And sometimes the things that we say and do portray things in a way that is unintended by the person conveying them. And so I think that one of the things that we ought to be worried about is the allegations of bias, and what can I do as an individual practitioner to minimize the risk of those kinds of things being alleged against you as an individual. And you know, there's a few things that you can do that will minimize your risk in that regard. I think the reality is anybody can claim anything they want, and there's not too much you can do about who claims what, but there's certainly things you can do to minimize those claims taking legs and causing you significant problems.
Craig, let's look at some examples. You mentioned that sometimes appraisers do not communicate as clearly as they possibly could, and that but there was no evil intent, as it were, in that poor communication, but that's how it's going to be interpreted against the appraiser. So could you give us some examples of what you're talking about by the appraisers communicating improperly?
Yes. If you look in the Fannie Mae selling guide, you will see that there are words that are prohibited, and they essentially represent code words. And whether you think it's a code word or not is irrelevant. But the market and participants in the market and the GSEs think that they're code words, and so the use of those words should be very carefully. If they are used, they have to be used exceptionally infrequently, and there has to be some pretty good reasons why you would use it. For example, crime-ridden or high crime area. One of the questions that come up is, what is a high crime area? What does that mean? Higher than what? Higher than, one death, per 1,000 people in a year, or 2 or 10, or what does it mean? I think sometimes we get used to talking in such vague terms that the words we use don't mean very much. This is a desirable area. As compared to what? What makes it desirable? Why is it desirable? And so instead of using, good and desirable and high crime and all of these kinds of things, that we need to be a little more specific. If it's a desirable area, explain why it's desirable. You might say this neighborhood has seen more sales than other competing neighborhoods because of its proximity to both schools, shopping, and public amenities. Those are all quantifiable kinds of things, but to use kind of a vague term, or this is a less desirable area. Well, less desirable than what? And so I think at some point we have to be cautious about how we develop these things. I think the second issue that we have as appraisers is that there's a lot of scrutiny that is being levied against the sales comparison approach to value. And you've got some out in the, out in the community that are suggesting, well, maybe we should use the cost approach because it would be so-called less bias than the sales comparison approach, because it costs what it costs wherever you're at. And that would take some of the bias out of the analysis. Well, on its surface, that sounds like it's plausible. The reality is I know, Tim, you review a number of reports. I know that I do. And I see very, very few cost approaches that are developed in a credible way. Oftentimes there's no support for the site value. The obsolescence is poorly developed. And so in practice, if I'm in an urban area where I have almost no land sales taking place, the idea that I can develop a credible cost value on a cost approach is not very likely. And I think the cost approach has some excellent possibilities, but I think I'd mentioned to you before, some years ago, we were building an industrial building and had put it out for competitive bid. And we did a formalized bid opening, and the range in costs from competent, qualified general contractors was 30% from high to low. And so this idea that there is a single cost that represents what it would take to replace a building, it's not as easy as you might think. And there are a lot of things that right now in the current environment that we're in, cost is changing so dramatically that it's hard to know what the real cost would be. So I think the reality for us as appraisers is that we need to do a better job in defining the subject neighborhood. The GSEs, and particularly HUD and FHA, want the name of the subdivision in the neighborhood description title or label. And it tends to imply that I'm obligated to select sales from the immediate subdivision. Well, that's good if you've got immediate, if there's good comparable sales, meaning sales that are really similar to the property. But oftentimes, if you've got a property with characteristics that are not found in that immediate subdivision, it may be more appropriate to go outside that immediate area to a neighborhood that is competitive, meaning that it has appeals to both buyers in both areas. and locate sales that will support the specific characteristic. Some of the situations we've had, I was talking with a very competent real estate agent in Chicago, and she felt like that they had been that there was appraisal bias against blacks, and her argument for that was that she is, like I say, she's a very competent real estate agent, and she provides the appraiser with some comparable sales. This happens to be a young black entrepreneur who has bought an old house. He's completely fixed it up, taken it from probably a Q5, or excuse me, a C5, up to a high C3 or maybe a C2, and has the property sold. The agent goes and finds similar properties that have had similar types of improvements made, and she then provides those comparable sales to the appraiser. The appraiser is the stereotypical old white guy who tells this agent that no thanks, I don't want to be influenced or manipulated. I will find my own comps. And then he goes and selects comps that this agent feels like they're further away, and they're not, I mean, and not as good. I mean, they didn't have the same level of renovation that had taken place. And so the value comes in below the purchase contract. And her perception is that it's a result of bias. Of course, we haven't seen it. I don't know the facts to the circumstance to a level where you could determine if the person was biased or if it was incompetent or just what. But the way that we handle and manage people and communicate have such a huge impact on the perceptions that we leave. And I think sometimes as appraisers, we are not as courteous and professional as we ought to be. And we leave impressions that we don't intend to leave because we're not handling situations as well as we should.
Well, Craig, leaving for a later discussion the concepts of pale, male, and stale, and recognizing that both of us are old white guys, let's go back to the cost approach. Now, you mentioned that there are those out there who are advocating let's just say the possible elimination of the sales comparison approach to be replaced with the analytics of the cost approach. But I think every appraiser knows that the cost approach has absolutely nothing to do with value until you put a site value in there and until you extract accrued depreciation from the market, both of which rely on the principle of substitution, which is the base of the sales comparison approach. So as a result, those who are criticizing us, and they're doing it very loudly and rather efficiently, are basically saying, well, you got to move to the cost approach because it doesn't involve the principle of substitution, but then you got to move into you've got to eliminate the sales comparison approach because of the principle of substitution, but then you got to move into the cost approach, which contains the principle of substitution. So it sounds like to me that those who are criticizing us are criticizing us because criticizing us is simple, not because they have a better plan. And it even sounds to me like they don't have a clue about what's going on. And so they're saying it ain't broke, but we're going to fix it anyway. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. And I think the reality is that we need to do a better job of explaining how, what was the criteria that I used in selecting comparable sales. If it's interesting because I think a lot of times we're trying to figure out what is my market area, what sales should I consider, what shouldn't I consider. And I know appraisers who select comparable sales based on the school district or based on the census tract or based on the zip code. And those are all fine. And, it's kind of easy because you've got boundaries already drawn for you, essentially. But the question is that how the market responds? Well, if I'm a younger family with kids in school, school district may be may be a significant thing. In our area, we have open school borders, and so nobody cares. I mean, I might have, if I've had kids that have been going to Snow Canyon High School, they may not want to go over to Desert Hills or Crimson Cliffs high schools because they have friends or whatever, and so they may prefer to stay in that area. But if they're like you and I don't care. I just need a house that's going to meet my needs in terms of size and utility, and it's just simply not an issue. And so I think there's a tendency for us to find these anecdotal solutions that don't require much thought, and oftentimes we fail to consider, that there's a wide range of potential market participants, and we've got to consider the entirety of the prospective market before we start drawing these really tight, narrow boundaries, so that we can try to be more accurate in how the market is going to respond for various characteristics. And so, I've seen situations where appraisers appraising a new home in an established area where there's very few new homes. And if they draw that boundary as the subdivision or a 1 mile radius, and they don't go beyond that, and they're using 15, 20-year-old homes as comparable sales for a brand new home, you're probably not going to end up with very reliable results on that. My wife once told me that her favorite color was new. And if you're looking for a new home, you're not looking at a 20, 30-year-old home. And so I think sometimes we kind of get tied into these ideas that it's got to be within this 1 mile radius or whatever it is that we're doing. And let's face it, we all run into situations where the data set that we wished we had isn't there. But we have to be able to make sure that we have done a really good job of identifying how we have made the selection. And it should never include protected classes such as race or religion or those kinds of things as the framework for making those selections. We're worrying about the real property, not about the people who occupy them. And so we just need to be careful as we do that to avoid some of those serious problems that can arise if we're not careful.
Craig, speaking of serious problems, let's go back to the concept of communication, which you raised earlier. Now, appraisers write for a living, but yet appraisers are not trained in writing. There are those classes exist. But to become a state certified residential real estate appraiser as far as I know, any state in the union, does not require a class specifically in writing. I'm not saying report writing. I'm saying a class specifically in writing. But yet appraisers are expected to know how to communicate, even though they're not trained in how to communicate that. So is that something that we're just going to have to get used to? It's just the way things are. Is that something we need to be worried about? Or am I just totally barking up the wrong tree with that comment?
No, I think that's true. I mean, there's a lot of things. You go to college and you take some classes. When I was going to college, I never really envisioned English as being something that was going to be that big of a deal. Turns out it is, but I, maybe wasn't as invested in some of that as I wished I would have been looking back, because you're right. It's taken a long time to get to a point where you can write efficiently, clearly, and without driving people crazy trying to figure it out is what you're trying to say. And so I think if someone wanted to improve their skill set, going in and getting, some additional training on writing would be is certainly a good thing. And I think at the very least, we ought to be aware of the kinds of word choices that we have, so that we are not inadvertently communicating things that would suggest something other than what we expect them to be.
Craig, let's talk about the principle of substitution for a minute before we get into the three areas that appraisers ought to be looking forward to. We talk about the principle of substitution. In other words, if the buyers can't buy the subject, they can go across the street and buy comparable A, because it's essentially the same thing as the subject. Okay, that's fine. Now, the USPAP does not mention the word neighborhood in standards 1 or 2, and it hasn't since about 2006. If you get into the 15th edition of the Appraisal of Real Estate and you go to the chapter on the principle of substitution, it does not say that a comparable property must come from the subject's neighborhood. Yet, if you go to any of the GSE's selling guides, well, they don't say that the comparable has to come from the subject's neighborhood. In fact, they allow for the fact that they may not. The implication is that's where you better look first. And if you're going to go out of the neighborhood, you better have a really good reason why, and you better explain it extremely well. So, Craig, are we appraisers being artificially limited in where we can go for comps simply because there's so many residential real estate appraisers who just make the assumption that they have to stay within the subject's neighborhood and ideally within a 1 mile radius, when neither one of those restrictions is actually true?
Yes, I think that is a problem. And I think a lot of this, is kind of driven by maybe the underwriting process, or maybe it's just misunderstanding what the requirements or the selling guides are for the clients or the intended users for which these appraisals we're developing are intended for. But having had a number of conversations with people at Freddie Mac and the VA and Fannie Mae, they want accurate, reliable appraisals. They don't want them too high. They don't want them too low. They want them to reflect what the market is doing. And when we impose artificial limitations in trying to determine what those are, we create problems for ourselves. And at some point, it compromises the public trust, meaning that the public doesn't trust us to be objective, competent, qualified, disinterested third parties in doing this. And so if we, we may need to step back and rethink how we make those criteria choices. And I think for me, one of the things that I'm trying to do a better job of is outline the thought process. Maybe it's something like, I looked in the subject neighborhood or in the subject subdivision and found a total of 4 sales. Only 1 was physically similar to the property. The search was then expanded to whatever that search was expanded to. And I looked for properties that were within 15% of the subject in size and within 10 or 15, 5 or 10 years of the subject in age, and found an additional, number of sales. And I selected the sales that were most recent from these competing areas as being most similar and giving the most reliable indication of value. And if I can kind of lead the client through the selection process, I think what that does is it helps in some degree to mitigate claims of bias, because you're discussing the thought process, and it has nothing to do with the color of the neighborhood or the religion of the neighborhood or anything else. And it is simply, I'm looking to find sales that best represent how the market is responding to some of these kinds of physical characteristics with the property.
Craig, we've spoken about aspects of appraising that appraisers need to be aware of, especially the political climate in which we find ourselves. Not, we have to be very careful about using the quote unquote code words, and we've got to be better at communicating, and perhaps we need to be more deeply educated, etc. So let's move to the other side of the coin. What are the three areas of, I don't know, blessing that appraisers have to look forward to, in your opinion?
Well, I know that technology is not necessarily something that many appraisers look at as a benefit, but they're developing some absolutely awesome technologies that can be just a super tool in helping us to develop better appraisals. And I think that as time goes on, you're going to see some of these things become better. And as we, as we don't limit ourselves by saying, well, I'm just too old, I'm not going to learn how to do that. When Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac roll out the new forms, I'm retiring because I don't want to have to learn how to go do something new. Well, at that point, maybe you should quit. But the reality is that there are going to be new technologies that will continue to emerge. And if we as appraisers will evolve with the technology and learn how to use this technology properly, I think it puts us in a really nice position to remain relevant in the market. As you and I have talked before, the fear that I have is that we don't embrace the technology. We try to continue to do things the way we've always done them. And the appraisers who do that find themselves outside of the loop in terms of what's going on. And all of a sudden the modeling, the AVMs become more reliable than we are. We're not going to be very much demand. But if we can continue to develop our skill set so that there is nothing more reliable than having a competent, qualified appraiser who understands the technology and can deploy it in such a way that we end up with very good results, we will always be in demand. And I think, while there's a lot of people who feel like that the future is bleak, I'm not one of them. There's certainly going to be change, and but I find that if you do a good job, there's always demand for your services. The nature of the services you provide may change a little bit, but there will always be demand for that. So I think technology is one of those things that can be our friend instead of our enemy.
Craig, thank you. All right, we're recording this in May of 2022. And in the last 6 weeks, interest rates have increased. By that, I mean first mortgage interest rates have increased. And the Fed is still indicating that at least twice more this year, it's going to jump interest rates by 50 basis points. In other words, half a point, at least twice. So we're looking at, a full 100 basis point jump. In other words, interest rates may go from 5 to 6%. So we all know that as interest rates increase, eventually people either have to make more money or prices have to come down so that the money folks do have goes to so they can have a place to live, so they can make the debt service on their houses. Now, take a look at both sides of that, if you will. What are the negatives of that for real estate appraisers? And what are the positives of that for real estate appraisers?
Well, I suppose the negative part is that you're not going to be doing as many refinance appraisals as you have done in the past. That's just common sense. The reality, I think, though, is that you may discover that there's more work for you to do as some of these adjustments take place. You might begin to see more foreclosures or appraisals where a loan's going into default and they want to have some kind of a collateral check to see, what's going on. And so I think there will still be opportunities out there. And so I'm not terribly concerned. I think one of the problems you're going to have is that appraisers are going to become very competitive on the fees. And it's too bad that when appraisers don't value their work enough that they will lower their fees to a point where some will cut corners to because, gee, I didn't get paid enough, so I'm not going to do the work I was obligated to do. And that's something that I think we need to be cautious of, because I promise you, your state regulator could care less what you got paid. There's they have the same expectation of performance, and if we cut corners because we're trying to get them done faster because we didn't get paid very much, we're going to have a problem on our hands. But I think the thing you may begin to see is that you're going to see fewer waivers offered by the GSEs, which means that if they're offering fewer waivers as the market starts to correct, then there will still be additional work for us to do. So it's going to become a little more competitive, and I occasionally hear people indicating their workload has dropped off. I know for me, I've managed to develop a fairly diversified appraisal practice so that it doesn't matter what's going on for us, there's always something for us to do. And I find that if you if you hitch your wagon to one pony and you're, as the mortgage rate goes, so does your business. We've never found that to be the case because we do a lot of additional types of valuation services so that when things ebb one way, they'll flow the other, and that it still manages to keep us all busy.
Craig, okay, talking about staying busy and talking about work dropping off, let's talk about, as we wrap this up, let's talk about desktop appraisals. Now, there are folks out there, many of whom are well-intentioned, who are saying that every time somebody does a desktop appraisal, that sound you hear in the background is civilization collapsing. And there are others who say that, desktop appraisal is, hey, it's just an appraisal. There's essentially no difference other than you don't put boots in the living room. So are desktop appraisals something we need to actively fight against? Are they something we need to benignly ignore? Or are they something that we need to go out and actively embrace?
Tim, I did a little video a while back. If anybody wants to go watch it, they can. It was on desktop appraisals. And the thing that I think we sometimes fail to realize is there are a whole host of different kinds of desktop appraisals. The desktop appraisal that is being rolled out by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are completely different than many of the desktop assignments that people have seen, where somebody's trying to get a home equity loan and they just need to get, they're using the desktop appraisal rather than getting an evaluation. It's below the de minimis, and so they don't even have to have an appraisal. They just need some valuation in the file. And so the client's requirements for that are significantly different than what the GSEs want. In those desktop appraisals, they've been going on for years, and there's some caveats that you need to be careful so you know what you're doing. The desktop appraisal still requires me to do all of the work of standard one, and I have minimum reporting requirements in standard two that I have to comply with. And so this idea that I can do a desktop appraisal for dramatically less, I mean, we'll see some of these where they're coming in at 25–30% of what someone would typically charge for a typical residential 1004. And if you want to do it, that's fine, but don't think because you didn't get paid much and you can cut corners and that nobody's going to complain, because I've seen it happen, and it's usually a problem. But the GSE desktops are not that much different than the 1004. In fact, talking to some of the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac folks, they have a number of the appraisals that they are getting submitted have deficiencies, because they will not use an extraordinary assumption. And you have to have a pretty good idea of what the property is, including a sketch with dimensions and calculations of square footage. And so you may ask, well, where am I going to get that? Well, if you don't have it, you can't do it as a desktop. So ultimately, the appraiser is the one, at least for the GSEs, that is going to determine whether or not you can credibly complete the assignment as a desktop or not. And unfortunately, we've got a lot of people that are doing these things when they don't have all the elements necessary to do it. And it's going to take a little bit of time to learn, and better understand. And so part of our obligations for competency is to understand what needs to be there in order to complete the desktop appraisal for the GSEs, because it's different than what it is for some of these other users. But on the other hand, I can see a situation where if I'm obtaining good, reliable information about the property, then I think it may become a benefit for some of those folks who are getting a little older, have mobility issues, but still very bright minds and competent appraisers. I've got a couple of friends who've had issues with, health, with knees or hip replacements or some of those kinds of things. This becomes a way for them to be able to maintain some level of work and not having to drive all over creation and still be able to make a living. But I think you just need to make sure you're cautious, you know what it is you're doing. And if you do, I think you're going to be fine.
Craig, thank you. From a standpoint then of desktop appraisals, basically, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that's going to be the appraiser's judgment call. An appraisal is an appraisal. The appraisal has to comply with standard 1. The appraisal report has to comply with standard 2, no matter what you call it. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely fair summary, yes. And we hear a lot of people getting really worried about the bifurcated appraisals. And the problem that we've got is there's so many of these terminologies that have similar meanings that it's hard to keep track. The GSE's definition of a bifurcated appraisal and desktop may be a little different than some of the other terminology that's used. But in the end, right now, the third-party inspectors, where that information is being provided to the appraisers rightfully so, have been concerned about who's providing me the information, how reliable is it, and there's a concern about, if I don't know who it is that's getting me this information, how can I rely on it? And I know in talking with some of the people at the GSEs, the vetting process they're going through and the amount of data that they're requiring is pretty significant. They don't want bad data being provided to the appraiser. So they're taking some pretty significant steps to make sure that the data collectors have the competency to perform or to obtain that data. And they've got 130 bits of data points that have to be communicated to the appraiser, including a number of pictures. And yes, there's always the concern that they are filtering out adverse features that might get you into trouble. But at the same time, the technology with the geocoding and some of the other metadata that you get in photos and things can give you some assurance that you can go in and see where the picture was taken, when. And so I think while there's maybe some risk, it's probably no more risk than you going in and looking at a property and missing something that that was there. And so there's risk in whatever we do. It's just, there's a degree of discomfort when we don't know where the information's coming from. And at that point, we always have the obligation to just say, in this particular case, I'm not comfortable with the data. There's some discrepancies. Either I'm going to decline the assignment or change the scope of work so that I can make sure we can clarify those issues. And that's our choice.
Well, Craig, thank you for that explanation on desktop appraisals. Thank you. I appreciate it. We've covered a number of areas. Anything else you want to get on your soapbox about anything, or anything else you want to bring up, or wish anybody happy birthday or anything like that?
Well, if I would have been thinking, I probably could have come up with something, but at this point, no, it's always fun to visit Tim. And, I know there's a lot of gloom and doom out there. I think that we need to look to the future with hope and with the realization that we have the ability to shape the destiny of where we go and what we do. And while there are most certainly going to be challenges, I feel fairly confident that if we continue to improve our skill set and learn how to use some of the tools that are becoming, that are being made available to us, that I think the future for being able to thrive as an appraiser is still pretty good. Maybe the only other thing I would add is that the GSEs have been developing a new reporting format for the appraisal. It's going to be a modular reporting format. The original plan was to have that go live in 2024. It looks like that's going to be delayed, and nobody's willing to say exactly when, but it looks like it will be delayed at least for a year. They won't have the MISMO format completely redone until the end of this year. And it's going to take the software providers roughly 18 months to get the software developed to be able to roll that out to the appraisers. And so it seems pretty likely that we probably won't see, and I think they'll probably want to have some beta testing take place before they roll it out live for everybody. So I think we're still looking to probably in the neighborhood of 2025 before you're going to see that change. I know there's a lot of worry about what that's going to do, but I've seen what the reports are going to look like and how these are going to be developed. And I think once we get familiar with how that's going to work, we're going to find that it's a pretty good system and will be much better than what we have right now.
Craig, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for bringing us up to speed on that new form. Yeah, there are a lot of appraisers out there who are worried about that. But appreciate your time, appreciate your expertise, and appreciate the fact that you're always willing to help your fellow appraisers. So everybody, that's it with Craig today. We'll be talking to Craig again because he's such a good guest. So we're glad you were with us. We hope to see you on the next time. And please be safe and well. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.